right, let's go there. I want you to imagine the air. It's thick, soupy with the jungle heat, and the scent of burning copal incense is so heavy you can almost taste it. The only light comes from torches, and it makes the shadows on the pyramid walls dance and writhe like they're alive. And it is not quiet. The night is a full-blown orchestra of the unseen, the jaguar's rasping call, the electric buzz of a million insects, and underneath it all, the deep, thudding rhythm of drums that feels like the planet's own heartbeat. This is the world of the Maya. And right away, we have a problem. Because the version of the Maya we all know, the one from textbooks and documentaries, is a little too neat. We get the brilliant mathematicians who invented the concept of zero, the genius astronomers with their perfect calendars, the serene philosophers. It's a comfortable, sanitized image, but it's a fantasy. Because carved into those very same temple stones is a much darker, wilder story. A story that's carnal, visceral, and, let's be honest, to our modern sensibilities, completely terrifying. So, if you think history is more than just kings and dates, if you're here for the raw, messy, passionate stuff, then you're in the right place. We're about to uncover a worldview where sex was a cosmic superpower and the human body was a literal, physical altar for negotiating with the gods. To really get the Maya, you have to start with their creation story. And it's intense. Forget a god simply saying, "Let there be light." For the Maya, the universe was kick-started by a divine sacrifice. Their sacred book, the Popol Vuh, tells us the gods had to literally spill their own blood to bring the world to life. And here's the crucial part. They believed that wasn't a one-time deal. They saw the cosmos as a living being that constantly needed to be fed to keep it from collapsing. And what was the fuel? The most powerful, life-giving substances they knew: blood and semen. Look, these weren't just biological fluids to them. They were the physical form of a sacred life force they called Ku. So offering them up wasn't about pleasure or love as we know it. It was a duty, a terrifying, painful, and apparently ecstatic duty. The line we draw between a bedroom and a temple, it just didn't exist for them. Your body wasn't yours, not really. It was a walking, breathing altar, and the fate of the universe depended on the rituals performed upon it. So, if your body is an altar, how do you make an offering? This is where things get incredibly graphic. For a Maya king, the ultimate act of piety was something that's almost impossible for us to even comprehend. After weeks of fasting and ritual purification, he would stand before his people and perform the ultimate offering. He would take a sharpened stingray spine, an obsidian blade, or even a jagged piece of bone, and pierce his own genitals. I know, it's hard to even hear. He would then thread a rough cord through the wounds to make the blood flow freely onto paper below. But the pain wasn't a punishment. It was a portal. The blood-soaked paper was then burned, and its smoke carried the king's own life force up to the heavens. It was a direct payment to the gods to keep the world running, to make the sun rise, the rains fall, and the corn grow. This wasn't some weird cult ritual. This was a core function of their government, proudly carved into stone for everyone to see. And what about the women? Were they just watching from the sidelines? Absolutely not. Royal women had an equally critical and just as agonizing role in this theater of power. We have these incredible carvings from the city of Yaxchilan showing the queen, a powerhouse named Lady Sock, performing her own sacrifice. But her offering didn't come from the organ of creation, it came from the organ of speech. The carvings show her pulling a rope studded with thorns right through her tongue. Again, her face is serene. Because the agony wasn't the point, it was the key. It was a tool to unlock a visionary trance, a bloody telephone line to the gods. In that state, she could commune with ancestors who would give her prophecies and guidance. Her suffering wasn't just a sacrifice. It was a way to get divine intel that could make or break her kingdom. This total fusion of the body and the divine meant that sex itself was a huge deal, something to be both celebrated and fiercely controlled. When noble couples had sex, for instance, it wasn't about passion, it was about astrology. The sacred 260-day calendar, the Tzolk'in, was basically a cosmic day planner that told them the perfect, most auspicious time to conceive a child. Getting it wrong could bring disaster. Passion had to wait for the stars to align. At the same time, you see places like the city of Uxmal, covered in phallic sculptures. These aren't graffiti. They're sacred symbols, which has led some to believe that ritual sex was performed there to honor the gods of fertility. But when something has that much power, it has a dark side. Adultery wasn't just cheating on your spouse, it was seen as cheating on the entire cosmos. It was an act of cosmic pollution that could bring famine or plague down on everyone. And the punishment was brutal and public. A guilty man could be legally stoned to death by the husband he'd wronged. The woman often faced an equally grim end. In their world, a private affair could have very public and very fatal consequences. But sometimes, offering your own blood just wasn't enough. Sometimes the gods were hungrier. And that's when their worldview reached its terrifying climax: human sacrifice. This wasn't random violence. It was a calculated, meaningful transaction to repay the cosmic debt. The best offering? A high-status enemy captured in battle. Sacrificing a rival lord meant you were capturing his sacred life force, his ka, and feeding it directly to your city's gods. It was a spiritual power transfer. The captive would be painted blue, forced to participate in a ritual ball game he was destined to lose, and then dragged to the top of the pyramid. There, he'd be stretched over an altar, and a priest would carve out his still beating heart as an offering to the sun god. It was the ultimate nourishment. They even sacrificed children, often by drowning them in sacred sinkholes called cenotes, to appease the rain god. It all came back to one core idea: the shedding of blood fertilized the world. In fact, some of their art depicts the absolute peak of this belief: men being sacrificed at the very moment of sexual union with a goddess, a horrifying, ecstatic fusion of creation and destruction, where death itself becomes an act that helps sustain the universe. So you have to wonder, how could a system this intense possibly last? Well, for centuries it worked. But a foundation built on blood is a shaky one. The pressure on the kings was immense. Their entire legitimacy rested on their ability to bleed, both themselves and their enemies. This created a non-stop arms race of ritual violence. But what happens when you perform all the rituals, spill all the blood, and the rains still don't come? What happens when you're facing decades of drought and famine, as we now know they were? Their only answer was to double down: more war, more captives, more blood. At some point, the contract broke. The gods were feasting, but the people were starving. You can only push a deal like that so far before it shatters. This crisis of faith, mixed with war and climate change, is what led to the great classic Maya collapse. The great cities of the South were abandoned, the monuments stopped being carved, and the jungle swallowed it all. The system had finally collapsed under the weight of its own terrible, bloody necessities.